Our urban leads. We're joined by Sheila Patel, who will be joining us online, and Andrew Norton, who's with us in person here. Representing Coastal is Federico Mazza, and our rural pillar lead, Tara Chu, who will also be joining us online. So, why are we here? Well, the purpose of this event is to recap and sense check what we have learnt during week one of negotiations with reference to resilience. We'll get a sense of what has actually been going on, and we will start with some reflections from all of our pillar leads. And then we will swiftly go on into deep diving a little bit more into new insights, new innovations. What are we hearing that's shocking? What have we not heard enough about? And what do we need to talk more about? We will also hear from Vice Minister of Peru, who will share some great examples and insight into their national adaptation plan. And finally, we will look and close the conversation about our hopes and our desires for week two's, this week's negotiations, and what we would like to see emerging from week two with reference to strategies for resilience and the need to understand what that looks like. So, without further ado, what I would like to do is kick off this morning with Sheila Patel. She is the founder and director of Society for Promotion of Area Resource Centres, and she's based out in Mumbai. And Sheila, she's going to provide us with some of her reflections addressing urban resilience. So, a very good morning, Sheila, if we can see you online and join us this morning. Is she? She's on mute. Sheila, I'm wondering, could you unmute your mic?
Is that better?
It is indeed. It is.
Okay.
Good morning, Sheila. So, we can see you. We can see you very well. Welcome, and
I can
over
hear
to you.
An echo of my voice, so I think it's gone now. So I'm so sorry. So first of all, hello to everybody in Glasgow. I'm sitting in faraway Mumbai and listening in on as many conversations as I can. And so you will forgive me if I don't just speak about what happened last week, but of the last couple of months in the preparation towards COP, which for me are very important both in the governmental and the non-governmental space. So I basically have several points that I want to raise, and if others have questions about that, we can do that later. So the first thing I want to say is that we have to juxtapose the challenges that climate change provides to us on a range of things and different geographies. And one serious geography and the location within that geography that is seriously neglected is informality in cities. We know that climate change is going to exacerbate the volumes of people who will seek urgent support and assistance and will move towards cities in their own countries or in other countries. And we see very little discussion between statisticians, demographers, city managers, national governments about the challenges that this is going to produce. We already don't know how to deal with in-migration. We already don't know what to do with dense informal settlements. So it's a big, big hole in our discussions because it's referred to in aggregating all the people who are vulnerable. But the implications of this volume of humanity being locked in very small spaces with no clear message and a clarion call to talk about all the governance structures that are impeding these processes and how do we globally and locally address these issues. That's one. The second very important thing is that a very large number of these people are young. So we keep talking about youth. But we don't talk about the youth who are locked in these circumstances, who really represent the largest volume of young people that are going to face the consequences of climate change in the next 20, 30 years, and whose communities, whose lifestyles, whose resource structures, whose resilience is completely unprepared to address this. So that's my second point. The third very important thing, which did come out in many of the discussions in COP and below, is that political will, governance architecture, resources that intelligently flow where they must, are being discussed. They always get discussed, but we do not see evidence of that discussion flowing in from one COP to the other and demonstrating that there is a huge impact. So we hear amazing commitments, but we never hear an assessment, which again needs to be granular, not global, but granular. And the last point that I want to make is that I represent a constituency whose only scope of survival is adaptation to resilient options. And as things stand today, both for the urban and the rural, poor and vulnerable, often landless, often identityless communities, this does not exist. I still do not know what came out in the loss and damage discussion, but if you calculate the destruction of poor people's lives by both natural and man-made calamities, it far exceeds anything that has been calculated so far. So if we want to truly fulfill our commitment to leave nobody behind, to make sure that the most vulnerable are not denied the benefits of new science, technology, new forms of transformation that we all speak about, then the governance architecture needs to be changed drastically. And I do not hear much about that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Inspirational insights there, and indeed your very last point there about destruction of people's lives. It just reminds us of why we're here, particularly today, Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day, and with reference to do not deny people's human rights to a decent quality of life. I'm sure is a thread that will come through, hopefully emerging throughout the discussions today. So my thanks to Sheila. I'm wondering, Andrew, we're going to be joined by now Andrew Norton, who's the director of the International Institute for Environment and Development, for his reflections on the urban pillar. So good morning, Andrew, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tasheen. Can you all hear me? Is the mic working? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, a few reflections to kick off on climate justice in this context and the urban context and how that intersects. Obviously, this starts with concerns with finance and multiple levels of access to resources, which is in many ways the sort of critical traction point of discussions around finance. That's finance for loss and damage, finance for resilience, but it's also kind of multiple level finance. It encapsulates elements of inequalities between countries, but also within countries as well. And for that finance to reach the local level and have a genuine impact on the people we need to reach, particularly some of the sort of stylized situations that Sheila was talking about, people in informal settlements and so on, then kind of the governance, accessibility and effectiveness of that finance, but also that it reaches communities in such a way that they have a say in how it's spent and they can determine their own priorities for building resilience with information that helps them to do that. Let me say a few words. One of the things we've been working on in IIED, our Human Settlements Group, over the last period has been the lessons of the pandemic. And there are many that are significant in this context, particularly the huge importance of local organisation, of community organisation and social mobilisation, and the incredible ways in which community organisations have structured responses and helped communities to lessen their risks, which are considerable due to particularly the density and lack of facilities that Sheila so powerfully articulated. A few words about rights. If we're talking about building resilience, the right sort of fairly, if you like, having traction on rights to housing on the place where you live is really critical. If people are to invest in building resilience in their own houses, in informal settlements, that makes an enormous difference if they know they have secure rights around that. And that's an area that I think hasn't had enough emphasis up to now. So there are a couple of other areas I could go into at this point, Tasheen. Do you want me to carry on, or do you want to come back at a later point?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think the points that you've raised there are absolutely critical issues during COP. Concerns with finance, it's not the volume of finance, but it's access to and ensuring availability of finance for those who need it the most. And I think it's a fundamental thing that I'm sure we will come round to in discussions. But your point about loss and damage, you mentioned there about rights. Indeed, this conversation is about shifting dialogue from repairing infrastructure to repairing people. People are left distraught. They are struggling physically and mentally, and what I'm hoping for through this conversation is to think about how we direct this conversation towards a more people-centred response to loss and damage, and indeed ensuring that finance reaches those from that perspective. So thank you, Andrew. I'll come back to you on some of those points. What I would like to do now is turn my attention to the coastal pillar. We're joined by Federico Mazza, who's the Programme Manager at Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, for his reflections on what he's been hearing through the coastal pillar of the Resilience Hub. Good morning to you, Federico, and over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So, reflecting from the coastal pillar perspective, the first thing I want to say is that I heard many saying that this is a different COP when it comes to oceans and the recognition of oceans in building the importance in building a resilience across the world, which I think it's also a natural evolution from what was COP25, the previous one, which was called the Blue COP. Science is clear. There cannot be a healthy climate without a healthy and regenerating ocean. Oceans, climate, biodiversity, they're all interconnected with each other, and they're all in measurable decline. So some of the environmental degradation that is happening around the world is also originating some societal issues that have particularly harder impacts on vulnerable communities, particularly marginalized groups like women, girls, or the younger generations, and make them more vulnerable to stuff like, for example, a global pandemic or the resulting decline in revenues from international tourism. Coastal and marine nature-based solutions are absolutely critical for building resilience around the world. They absorb carbon and stabilize the climate, but also there are 3 billion people around the world that depend on fish and the products from the oceans for their sustenance, for their livelihoods, particularly in small island developing states and coastal least developed countries. So over the first week, we have heard several pledges and commitments from governments and corporates to protect and restore oceans, which is great because there's an enormous financing gap for oceans. We hear that developed countries have failed to meet their 100 billion goal in 2020. for all developing countries, and that's even more true for SIDS that normally so far have attracted 1 or 2% max of global climate finance flows. And so on last Friday, Aura has hosted a roundtable with the UK government that has brought together governments, corporates, and civil society, and where at least $20 million in investments were pledged for different coastal and marine solutions to build resilience and protect nature. And I think every little drop counts in this fight. We need to scale investments from the millions to the trillions of dollars in the ocean and coastal context. But as my colleague said before, it's important that these high-level pledges are also met with real on-the-ground impact to make sure that these projects actually deliver resilience to the marginalized groups on the ground and really help them to adapt to climate change. And that's essentially the mission of Aura. We work with partners, including community-based partners in the Global South, to incentivize the creation of financial and insurance innovative products. And we have a goal of mobilizing $500 million for ocean solutions by 2030, and also helping 250 million people becoming more resilient.
Thank you, Federico, for that. And indeed, again, the issue of finance is coming through. But your intervention there about on the ground realities and what we're hearing a lot about through the coastal pillar is the reliance on young people in these areas, and that young people are indeed the backbone of society, and keeping them there in these environments is absolutely vital to help build a future and a sustainable future for and livelihoods for all. So I will come back to those points just shortly so we can have a bit of a discussion on that. But before we do so, thank you, Federico, I'd like to welcome Tara Chu, who will be talking to us about what she's hearing, what's been happening through the rural pillar. Tara is Associate Director at Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Markets, Risk and Resilience. So a very good morning to you, Tara, if you could join us now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be able to be a part of this, and I appreciate the time to contribute. First of all, I want to acknowledge that last week, one of the great things we saw was the release of the Insure Resilience Global Partnerships Evidence Roadmap for Climate and Disaster Risk Finance and Insurance. And I was very proud and honored to be able to be a part of that contribution. In particular, I think that as we think about direction of large amounts of financing that are coming through increasingly, it's important to think about how we make best use of this financing through rigorous evidence generation. So there are two things I want to mention about that struck me as particularly important. The first is that as we think about loss and damages, and indeed we need to think about not just resilient infrastructure and rebuilding infrastructure, but resilient people and rebuilding people's lives, I think there's an opportunity to more carefully consider research and then perhaps target interventions in a way that thinks about resilience not only from the perspective of helping people rebuild their lives in the aftermath of a disaster, but through managing the risk they're regularly exposed to, allowing them to make prudential investments, to transformative investments to help them better adapt to climate risks and grow and promote inclusive agricultural growth in a way that makes them more resilient to any future shocks. So looking not just at recovery through climate disaster risk finance and insurance, but also how that can be an enabling thing for investments in climate adaptation. The second part I want to mention is I saw a lot of emphasis on local engagement and engagement with people on the ground and in the communities. And this is absolutely essential. I, of course, agree. I think there's been an underutilization of local research capacity in particular. When we think about the evidence that's being generated to help target these huge donor investments, we need to think about research being locally relevant, locally demanded, and then transferred to local institutions with the capacity to pick up and adopt and scale those interventions that truly seem promising. There's been a huge underutilization of the local research potential, particularly outside of urban areas and the rural areas in a lot of countries. And I think that we need to focus more on providing resources to these institutions as well for the evidence generation, and then enhancing their capacity as needed, rather than Western institutions consistently taking the lead in evidence generation and perhaps using them on the ground as necessary. I think we really need to start transferring that locus of leadership to local institutions, particularly in rural areas, for evidence generation and targeting of resources.
Thank you, Tara, for that and your reflections there. And indeed, local leadership is really, really important part of this conversation. But I'm wondering, I'm going to take this opportunity just to remind everyone this is a hybrid event. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, do raise your hands. And I have David, who's monitoring the chat online. But if I could turn my attention to Sheila and to Andrew to try and push the conversation forward a little bit. We're hearing a lot about young people. We're hearing a lot about innovation. We're hearing a lot about women designing interventions and acting as innovators. And indeed, in terms of locally led adaptation, people are taking matters into their own hands to rebuild their lives. Do you get a sense that the responsibility is shifting towards local people to deal with the climate crisis themselves, because perhaps there is a sense that there is no support coming, and so they feel that the onus of responsibility is to help themselves. Otherwise, what next? I'm wondering, Sheila, if I could ask for your reflections on that first, and then Andrew, if I could ask for your reflections on that too. So Sheila, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, Sheila.
Unmuted
Very well,
myself. Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Andrew and Tara and everybody for your contribution. They are very, very important and fit very interestingly in many of the things I think are critical. So let me start off by saying that this is not something new, that, when you see poor people in a sort of survival mode, surviving floods, surviving droughts, then everybody puts the light on them and says, oh, they're so good. And then there's a nice abdication of state responsibilities, global responsibilities. A little bit of money is thrown in here and there. A few research things demonstrate how innovative it is, and then it's forgotten. So I think that the role of social movements, such as the Shack Dwellers International, the rural social movements of people working with indigenous groups, with people who work with fisher folk and tribals. I think it's our major responsibility to not allow global, national, and private sector institutions from abdicating their role in the transformation that we all have to participate in. There's no point in just saying, for government saying, oh, this is too big for us, let's give it to the private sector. Private sector saying, oh, we'll do all this, but we have to look at the profit margin, so we'll forget the bottom 50%. I mean, all this kind of abdication is permitted with complete and total transparency without being accused of these things. So I think the duty bearers have to take responsibility for their roles. Governance choices that are made globally and nationally are critical to be in place for poor people's solutions to thrive and produce seriously good quality adaptation and resilience. Adaptation happens within the knowledge frame that people have. We need new knowledge. We need traditional knowledge and new knowledge to be explored to produce the new fix that we need to be a living, breathing, and life planet. And for that, poor people have as much right to knowledge, to research, to owning their data, to being acknowledged for what they do, and being brought into the decision-making and response producing solution instead of just continuing to be beneficiaries and consumers of whatever little sprinkling of whatever knowledge and cute little researches that are going on. And I think scientists and serious thought leaders in the world have to lead that process. Social movements are there to make that noise, to keep reminding everybody that you cannot transform the world with just 15 to 20% people who are presently getting all the benefits of the transformation. So I think the issue is, how do we produce these new engagements, this new architecture of interaction and knowledge creation, so that it becomes useful and reaches everybody? Because that is the message that I am only hearing something about, but not seeing evidence about. So I feel that is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, for that. Andy, if I could rope you into the conversation now. This indeed is about shifting responsibilities and a human rights conversation as well.
Yeah, very much. If I could also raise a couple of issues, because one of the things we need to think about is change over time as well, and how the challenges will evolve in a decade from now. And there's some very valuable work going on to try and look at those issues at the moment, but at the same time, the challenges will be considerable. I mean, one of the things that will hit particularly the urban space over time, particularly in low and middle income countries. We've seen this process whereby displaced people and even refugees increasingly are finding themselves in the urban space rather than traditionally in camps. That's a huge challenge, and it will increase. Numbers of people displaced and mobile because of the climate crisis will increase. And that requires us to look not just at the people who are moving, which is what the humanitarian communities tend to do, but also about how localities can be supported, both municipalities, but also these social movements that Sheila was talking about so eloquently. And from IIED, we've done some work looking at how social movements will engage with incoming populations, recognizing them as co-citizens in the urban space. But this is going to be something tremendously important over 10 years. And the other thing, if I could mention just very quickly, Sheila's talked a lot about informality, informal settlements, but also informal work and informal labor markets. One of the things that's going to be a huge challenge is heat stress for people who labor in poor countries, who frequently don't have good access to water or shade or all the things that make that tolerable. So there needs to be a kind of barefoot health and safety initiative to work around that. And these are problems, we've looked at them a bit at IIED, but there isn't funding at the moment to look at how we support communities and how we support people that work in the informal sector to deal with what's going to be a considerable issue for them over the coming years.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andy. And I think your points there about recognition is so important. I mean, obviously, you know, the movement of people has an impact for the world over in terms of global conflict, peace and security, the movement of people. We already know that the stats are there themselves. Over the last decade or so, 300 million people have already been displaced, and projections are up to 1.2 billion are at risk of displacement by 2050. So it's a huge figure. And the issue from a climate justice perspective is recognising people who have moved because of climate-related disasters, and indeed ensuring their protection, because at the moment, the minute they move, they become unrecognised, and they lose their sense of value and purpose and become a nobody. And this, from a climate justice perspective, really does have to change. But that point, Andy, and also Sheila, as you were talking there about informal settlements, our global environment is changing, it is heating up. People are dying because of heat stroke and death. And there's an onus of responsibility on the world over to ensure that we secure a decent quality of life, and everyone has the right to a decent quality of health and well-being. And so it's really important that we look at that. I'll come on to the mental health crisis in a minute, and perhaps we can talk about that. But I'm wondering, Federico, if I could just bring you in before we...
Dear COP delegates, we kindly remind you to wear your face mask over your mouth and nose at all times during your time at the conference, unless you are seated in a room with appropriate distance, while eating or drinking, or are medically exempt. Thank you for your cooperation.
Apologies for that. But Federica, if I could just keep this conversation going. Andy and Sheila were talking about young people taking, social innovation. There's a lot of that happening. Can you just describe to us to what extent young people are having to fend for themselves, getting involved in agriculture and fishing to provide livelihoods for themselves and for their families? How significant is that, and what burden is being placed on young people in coastal areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And also starting from the topic of displacement, of course, talking about coastal resilience. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people that are at risk all around the world, especially in SEEDs and coastal LDCs. So obviously that's like a particularly important topic. Regarding the youth, I just wanted to say that I've been hearing a lot of considerations and voices from the youth in the first week, but particularly maybe outside of the building rather than inside. We had the pleasure of having a representative from the youth at the round table that we had last Friday. Her name is Maya Delaney from the Bahamas, and she was talking about her experience from the hurricane that hit the Bahamas, I think, in 2018. And she was in the middle of a group of ministers and high-level corporate CEOs, and it was great to hear her thoughts. Many ministers applauded her remarks because they said we need to continue to hear what's important for the younger generations. We need to be reminded on a constant basis that we need to be staying on track, and that these are the important things. So that was very nice to see. I want to come back to the topic of financial innovation, because I think there are several examples of what I said before, like the projects and initiatives and innovation that have an impact on the ground. And now I don't want to spoil it too much, but later at 12 noon here in the Resilience Hub, we're going to showcase some of these examples for about innovative financial solutions and insurance products that also have an impact on communities. Most of these are community-led examples and nature-based solutions, so that initiatives that don't only have generate environmental benefits, but they also generate jobs, generate social opportunities, especially in the global south. And just to give you some examples, we're going to hear about a parametric insurance program in Central America that will allow rapid deployment of funds in the event of cyclones that reach a certain magnitude. So as soon as the magnitude is reached, there are immediate payouts to the local communities, to fishermen, to the people involved in tourism sector. And that's very important to have this immediate payout, immediate financial relief to get over the stress, the immediate stress that comes after, of course, an extreme weather event or like a cyclone can be. We're also going to hear about an innovative insurance scheme, again, in the Philippines this time, that is targeting fisher folks. And again, this is another example of how we can reach resilience on the ground in coastal communities by using innovative insurance products. that can also lead to the reduction of overfishing in this country. So like multiple benefits all at the same time that can be brought together by innovative instruments.
Thank you, Federico. Some great examples there. And I'm wondering, could I just turn to Tara, if you're still there with us online? Tara, we're just continuing this issue about people taking matters into their own hands. And when we talk about relate that to climate justice, in terms of injustice, people are, particularly in rural areas, drowning further in debt, which is unjust and unfair. Tara, could you give us your reflections on how we even begin to tackle that, people drowning in further debt, to tackle to deal with the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult problem because in many contexts you have people taking on debt that perhaps shouldn't be for the wrong reasons, and in other contexts you have people who can't access credit in order to make investments in climate adaptations. So thinking about how to carefully structure these kinds of financial innovations that are meant to be enabling to people to adapt to climate changes and climate disasters, but being able to do it in such a way that is quite careful that they're not actually making the situation worse by trapping people into these debt cycles or encouraging them to take risks that are perhaps not as wise investments. So in particular, just jumping off something Federico brought up, which is agricultural insurance products, which in particular parametric or index-based products are a great opportunity that's being looked at to link to credit opportunities, such that if people are taking out credit for prudent investments and a shock occurs, an insurance payment can help prevent them from falling into these debt cycles. At the same time, while that's quite promising, as these products continue to increase in number and come from a variety of different sources, it's, I think, important to make sure that we're stepping back and doing a stock taking of these different products and how they're managed, regulated, evaluated, in that some products, it's absolutely essential that these products be well designed to effectively help manage risk and prevent that descent into debt cycles that we keep seeing in some environments, or prevent people from being locked out of credit opportunities when perhaps they could lead to wise investments. So ensuring that while we're looking at these index-based products particularly, that we're coming up with mechanisms to evaluate them and the way they're linked to other finance like credit, but looking at the products themselves to ensure that they're designed in such a way that will actually truly benefit people and clients, such that they're very, very accurate in triggering at the right times, so that people aren't paying premiums, taking out credit, making decisions on products that then fail when they're most needed. So making sure that we're, as we develop new products, developing also new ways to evaluate the products themselves, their quality, and ensure that while we're allowing for innovation and innovative approaches to finance solutions, we're making sure that at a minimum we're doing no harm, and we're allowing people who are mobilizing finance for these products to look at different options and make sure that they're actually addressing these issues, such as risk exposure in general and risk exposure in terms of exposing yourself to debt in ways that are truly effective and as we hope they will operate.
Thank you, Tara, for that. And I think that business about trapping people into debt relates to a burgeoning mental health crisis, but we don't really have time to talk about that just now, but it's work that we're doing at the Centre for Climate Justice, looking at the mental health crisis and climate change. We've got one question online, but I'm just also conscious of time, but I wonder if we could take the questions towards the end, if that's okay. And what I'd like to do is go quickly into the next segment of our conversation this morning. We've heard a lot about what we've heard in the first week. Can you give us maybe 1 or 2 points around what is new, or what is surprising, or indeed what is shocking, or what is not being talked about enough out of week 1 that you would like to see coming out of week 2. So I'm wondering, Tara, if I could rope you back in for this, if you could kick off a conversation on that. What's new? What's shocking? What have we not heard enough about in week 1 that you would like to see in week 2?
Not to be a broken record, but just to build off of what I was just speaking about, I think that we need to have a greater awareness that in as much as kind of a recognition of the tricky balance between wanting to allow for very innovative approaches that are creative and approach problems in new ways, also figuring out ways that we're also protecting people from good intentions gone wrong. So innovative products that perhaps weren't developed in comprehensive ways or aren't tried and true or necessarily have had the time to have a strong evidence base generated around them, making sure that we're not necessarily holding people back from innovating, because that's how some of the most exciting solutions are being found. Many of the solutions that we're talking about over the past week, and that I know we're going to be talking about over the next week. But as these new innovations come out, how should they best be regulated? How should they best be supported? How can the public and private sector unite in such a way that we're allowing for innovations to come forth while still providing that basic protection to these already vulnerable people, that these innovations will, at a minimum, not leave them worse off? So that tension between urgency and care and diligence and patience is something that I think warrants greater discussion in terms of the best way to approach it, particularly in a way that partners the public sector, the private sector, and then the individuals who are being targeted by these interventions on the ground.
Thank you, Tara, for that. And that point, the urgency and care needs to be met very carefully. Andy, if I could turn to you, have you seen anything that's shocking, not shocking? What are we not seeing enough about? Can you just sense check that with us?
Well, I worry that we're not thinking enough about the extraordinary ways in which power structures will change. As the world continues to change in the urban context, geographies will change. Obviously, many cities around the world, particularly coastal cities, will be entirely reshaped over the coming decades. That will have impacts on inequality, impacts on both inequality at the bottom but also at the top. We can talk for a moment about the pandemic, which was not something that was entirely disconnected from climate change and ecological collapse. There clearly are. It's clearly one of those extreme events that are unpredictable, but that are connected to the ways in which the world is changing. Now, that hit poor people very, very hard, and we know all the stuff around if you can work from home, you are better off than if you can't work from home, all that stuff in the middle. But we also saw this shocking rise in wealth at the top end as well. So these questions of, there are clearly some kinds of business models that enable people to benefit massively from huge disruption. I mean, exponentially from huge disruption. So what's that going to do to the entire structures of power and governance? And how will that feed through into the ways that people survive at the local level in the end, which is where it matters? But what's going to happen to inequality and power? Specifically, I'm speaking to the urban dimension here within cities. This is something I think it's a big issue, but we need to get to grips with it, because in the end it will affect the governance of local spaces, and that will have a profound impact on how people cope or can't cope with the changes that are coming. So that's kind of a big issue. It's a kind of frontier issue. It's something people are aware of, but I don't think we're getting into the depth we need to in thinking about those futures and what they're going to mean.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for bringing that in. And indeed, the COVID crisis, we're not hearing enough about the impact that that's had with reference to climate and inequality, and it's significant. And as you described there, the power structures and how we deal with that, we need to get to grips with that conversation and get that going for sure. So thanks for raising that. Federico, if I could ask you for your thoughts on anything that's surprised or shocked you or
Yeah.
What do you want to hear more about?
Yes. Well, in terms of shocking, like definitely the weather last week in Glasgow was pretty shocking, but I'm glad it rained, it poured rains over Saturday, so I'm not surprised anymore. Jokes aside, so from the coastal perspective, one of the expectations I would like to see from this week is that the role of oceans being more formalized within the UNFCCC processes, because it's been kept out for long. And as I said before, the science is clear, and it's important that the resilience aspects of oceans are included in these discussions. So there needs to be a regular ocean climate dialogue happening, where countries have a possibility to discuss these topics and discuss actions. Not just on international level, but also domestically. So oceans and coastal priorities need to be included more widely into the national determined contributions of countries and their climate agendas domestically. And we already seen some difference from the first cycle of NDCs in 2015. Now more countries are including coastal and oceans in their NDCs. Another thing that I would like to see is more progress towards the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which I imagine many of you know will dictate the rules of future international carbon markets. And this will have implication on the ground in the global south, because it may open the door to new revenues coming, for example, from like blue carbon credits. And that will make like the financial viabilities of many ecosystem projects in the global south possible. And the other thing, the final thing that I would like to hear more is more debate and discussions about the progress towards net zero and climate resilience from ocean-based industries like shipping or tourism or fisheries. In a recent report that we have made with WWF and Metabolic, we found that there are more than $8.4 trillion in worth of assets from the blue economy that are at risk out there because of the degradation from oceans and climate. And that's twice the size of the German GDP. That's a lot of money. But the good news is, if a new pathway is taken of sustainable development, of pollution control, of reducing the overexploitation of oceans, it's possible to reduce significantly this number to $3.3 trillion of value at risk, which means over $5 trillion over 15 years in savings, that it's basically equal to the GDP of the UK. So I think from my perspective, it is totally a no-brainer, and that's absolutely resilience.
Thank you, Federico. And can I turn to Sheila, if you're there? Sheila, give us your thoughts. What do you want to see? What do you need to hear from week 2? What have you not heard in week 1?
Well, everybody speaks about the pandemic and everything, and you mentioned about wanting to talk about mental health, so I want to give you a segue. That in the end, whether it's the planet's health or our human physical and mental health, it's in a bad state right now. The number of people who are malnourished in the world has grown. We have unsustainable management of food supplies. We have more and more people having chronic diseases out of eating food they shouldn't be eating, and poor people's food becoming rich people's superfood so they don't get it. Talk about injustice. And most importantly, the mental health of people. You know, all over the world, if you look at the number of suicides of young people out of depression and terrible mental conditions, these are all small fires burning right now that are not being looked at. But the COVID crisis showed us that we don't have an adequate preventive and primary health facility that we need in the first 10 years of the next decade because things are going to get worse before they get better. And the need for developing deeper consciousness about a good quality of life depends on mental and physical health. And that worldwide is deteriorating. And I don't see health as a significant part of the discussions, just as the need for open spaces, the need for democratizing voices. These are all seemingly, things that you can't touch and feel, and people don't talk about it. And so I think that there is a deep interconnectedness in everything that we discuss.
Thank you.
So, Tara, you spoke about food and agriculture, and this is much at the heart of it. And poor people in India are committing suicides like nothing before because of indebtedness due to being pushed to buy fertilizers and pesticides, depleting the soil. I mean, I'm not a rural person, I'm an urban person, but I consume all that. And we all know the impact of what's going into our bodies and what it's producing. And I don't think that we are talking about this at all, because ultimately, if you talk about survival, these are fundamental basis of what will give us the impetus to produce resilience and transformation. And I don't think we talk about things that we can't quantify and turn into trillions of millions of dollars, because they seem too nebulous. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And indeed, that was really important that we talked about the health crisis, the human right to a decent quality of life. And just talking about health, the World Health Organization indeed have a pavilion here at COP26 for the first time, which is absolutely fantastic. And for anyone who's interested, the Centre for Climate Justice, I will be leading a panel on the WHO pavilion on Thursday at 6:15, looking at climate change, climate justice, and a burgeoning mental health crisis. So if you're interested in coming along to that, I don't have time to explain it just now, but do come along, and we will be unpacking what that conversation is looking like so far. So with that, I want to thank all the pillar leads who have joined us this morning, and for their insights and their reflections. What I would like to do is now introduce you to Mr. Alf. So a big show of hands for our pillar leads just now, so thank you very much. What I'd like to do is introduce Mr. Alfredo Mamani, who's the Vice Minister of Strategic Development from the government of Peru, and he'll give us just a few minutes of reflections on something innovative they're doing through their national adaptation plan. So a very good morning to you, Alfredo, and I'll hand over to you.
Hello, good morning to everybody. We came from Peru. It's very, very far away from here. Okay, I'm going to explain what we are doing about the National Adaptation Plan. As you know, in our country we have lost 53% of glacier surface last 50 years. 60% of the registered disasters are related to climate change. And 50.5 million Peruvians are exposed to very intensive rainfall, and 2.6 million from dry period and 5.6 million to cold period. In this context, National Adaptation Plan has been approved on June of this year and constitutes a milestone on the country action plan. And this is a strategic document for the adaptation at climate change. It is supported by climate change law and the Paris Agreement. It has a priority objective to contribute, excuse me, okay, to contribute and reduce the risk and the climate change effects, and who are oriented to the population which their means and the life was not affected, and the ecosystem, basins, and territories, and also to the infrastructures and services, and which strategic actions we did. We obtained 92 adaptation measures in the sectors of health, and also in the water, agricultures, and forests, and also in fish and aquaculture. And 47 of these 92 adaptation measures are in ability conditions. And how we are on that? 5 are ongoing on health, 6 in the habilitant conditions on the forest sector, and 8 are going on water conditions. And in the agriculture, we have 17 habilitant conditions, and the agriculture and fishery, 11 conditions in the inhabitants. Okay, and what we are looking for to put this in practice for the implementation, we need some support on financial and also in technical support. That's a very huge objective, but we think that we can do on we are work together. Okay.
Thank you very much, Minister. That's really it's really good to hear some real life reflections about activity that's actually happening on the ground and translating into sort of real change, which is fantastic to hear. So thank you, Alfredo, for that. I'm wondering now, in the interest of time, I'm going to turn to David to see if there's any questions that we've got that's come in through the chat box for any of our panel members, and indeed for Alfredo.
Thanks. It's good to be able to engage globally for these events, and we have a comment in from Beatrice Hattie, who's at the Center for Frugal Innovations in Nairobi. I'll frame her question as a comment because I know we're short of time, but maybe the panelists would like to respond. And Beatrice's comment is around the significance of governance in managing risk, adapting to shocks, and thriving. And the question or comment is around how shifting power relations and how new forms of multi-level governance are showing the capability of achieving adaptation, including for low-income and vulnerable groups, with a particular focus in Beatrice's question about how grassroots organizations can involve themselves effectively within governance arrangements for resilience.
Thank you. I mean, it's a great comment, actually, and it's a wonderful segue into closing the event this morning. There's absolutely no doubt about the shift in power relations. I think all of our pillar leads were mentioning the need for that it's coming through, but we need to pay more attention to that. And indeed, as the climate crisis burgeons and grows, I think we need to pay a lot of attention on that. But what I would like to do is just thank everyone for their contributions this morning. I know it's been a very early start. Sheila and Tara, appreciation for joining us online. It'd be wonderful if you'd been here in person, but for all our audience who've been joining us online and everyone here physically, thank you for listening in. And this is a conversation that doesn't stop here. It's a conversation that will indeed continue as part of the Resilience Hub over the next months and years as we go forward. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.